Yeah, I've been doing this for a long time. I was looking at a recent, I shouldn't say recent, a newsletter that Sylvia and I both had a publication in back in 2007, and I was reading through those articles while I was listening to Sylvia talk. And I was going, she said that in 2007? She said that in 2007. So I looked at my own article and I said, oh, I'm going to say that. And so, you know, it's not so much that we haven't been talking about this for a while. It's apparently we just haven't had the right group of people to talk to, and hopefully you are those people. If you've heard me talk before, you know I always talk about IPv6 in the real world, not in some fantasy world. I always try and talk about things that are practical and straightforward. Today, they'd asked me to talk about planning your IPv6 transition, so that's what I'm going to be talking about. How many of you have run big IT projects of any kind? How many of you know what ITIL is? How many of you actually have an ITIL infrastructure in your organization? Okay, your IPv6 transition is just another ITIL project. If you think of it like that, it makes everything a lot easier to think about because all the same things are involved. It's not rocket science. You don't have to have a degree from MIT to do it, but you do have to do the steps that you would go through for any large IT project. Some of the points Sylvia made earlier, I'll try not to bore you with making them again, but they're worth thinking about. You know, the more you can leverage what you need to do for this with other things that you need to do anyway, the better it is. And if you have a change management infrastructure already in place in your organization, you should leverage it because it can help you economize a lot of things, not just deploying IPv6, but anything else that you need to do. So basically, there are three major factors. Planning, big factor. Training, often overlooked, but a big factor. And then, of course, you have to actually do the work. You have to implement it. There are lots of pieces to all of these things. So we're going to, first of all, start off by talking about planning. One of the biggest things you have to think about is when you put a new protocol on the network, how does it affect the policies that you already have in place for operating your infrastructure? So you first of all need to know what you do. Do you have a policy? Have you actually got a security policy, an operating policy, or anything written down about how you run your network? If you do, you need to review those. If you don't, you might need to get some. It's a good idea to actually know how things work in your environment, and writing them down is a first step in that process. So we talk about IPv6 having a lot of features that are wonderful and marvelous, but there are also a lot of things in IPv6 that are just like they are in IPv4. You still have TCP. It still uses ports. Do you need a different policy for how you manage port usage of your TCP applications on IPv6 than you do IPv4? I don't know the answer to that question, but you should come up with an answer. In most organizations, the answer will be no. I don't need a different policy there. I can use the same policy for how I manage ports on IPv6 and IPv4 for TCP. Same question for UDP. You still have UDP in IPv6, just like you do in IPv4. Do you need a different policy for managing UDP over that infrastructure? So for a lot of you, that's going to be a big step because you can say, same thing here, same thing there. Where the most often you get bit is when you talk about dynamic aspects of your network. How do you manage dynamic addressing in IPv4? Well, it'll be different in IPv6. You can use some of the same ideas because there's some of the same stuff, but there's a lot of things that aren't the same. And so you need to think about that. How do you manage ICMP in IPv4? Well, some of those things will apply in IPv6 and some of them won't. Now, your policy, whatever it is, may not go into that level of detail. You may not even have a piece of anything in your policy that says what you do with ICMP, I don't know, redirect packets on your network. That's fine. Whatever works for you today, if it can be mapped into IPv6, that's probably going to be your best answer. But you need to actually look at it and evaluate it. One of the things that's also very important is to think about your inventory. Now, do you know what's on your network today is the first question you should ask. How many PCs do you have? How many servers do you have? What operating systems do they have? What's the patch levels? What applications run on those environments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? How much mobility do you allow on your network? How many wireless networks do you have? How do you configure them? How do people move back and forth between the various parts of your wireless infrastructure? Again, you should already have this written down somewhere. If you don't, that might be a good first step for you to take, is to actually document all this stuff. Because if you want to do a successful addition of IPv6 to your network, knowing what you have now is going to be an important aspect of that. The next step, once you actually have the inventory, oh, by the way, if you don't know how to do this, there are lots of tools that you can get to do that. There are people who will come help you do that. Cisco has a product in particular that you can talk to your Cisco rep about acquiring that will go out and reach into your network and do a lot of this inventory stuff. But, you know, hopefully you've got some of that already in your network today. Hopefully you know some of these things today. But if you don't, there are solutions. Anyway, once you have the inventory, you need to look at the stuff and say, okay, can the vendor tell me that this software, this environment that I run is IPv6 ready? Hopefully your vendor can tell you that. In some of your cases, there might be software that you're running for which the vendor has disappeared. Gosh, I don't know what to tell you about that other than, well, you're probably not going to be able to migrate that to IPv6. But hopefully you're using vendors that are still around like Oracle as an example. They'll be able to tell you what is and is not capable of running v6. And even though they've acquired Sun, they still won't be able to tell you everything that they sell runs v6. That's too bad, isn't it? But it's true. Microsoft's done a really great job of making most of their stuff run on v6, but even they don't have everything that runs on v6. But you need to ask the question, you know, okay, I'm using SharePoint 2003, will it run in v6? I'm using AutoCAD version 2, will it run in v6? You need to ask your vendors to help you with the answers to these questions. There are also going to be some dedicated your devices in your network, little closed boxes, print servers, whatever, that you'll need to find out, can they run v6? Sometimes the answer to the question is, I don't care. I'm not going to migrate them. That's an okay answer as long as you know that the only people that need to use that device can get to it via v4. And in many networks that will be the case because in the ideal scenario, you're adding v6 to your network. You're not taking away v4. You're just adding v6. Another aspect of planning is to figure out what's the impact of all this going to be on everybody. You know, is the accounting office going to not be able to issue bills while we're doing this transition? Well, I would submit to you that if the answer to that question is yes, you need to go back to the drawing board because that's probably not what you want to be doing. Are your sales organization going to not be able to sell product or enter orders while you're doing this? Again, if the answer is yes, they can't enter orders while we're doing this migration, I would submit that that's probably meaning you need to go back to the drawing board and figure that out. That doesn't mean you can't have some disruptions on the network, but you need to time those disruptions so they have the least amount of impact on everybody else. And that should be something that you can do. I say that, and then I know that there's always going to be exceptions to that answer, but to the extent that that's possible, you need to design your plan so that it impacts everybody as little as possible. The perfect plan, and there probably isn't one, but the perfect plan would have you go in, make the transition, and the next day, nobody noticed. That, to me, should be the goal. Nobody noticed. But the likelihood of that being a reality in your environment, probably very small. So just keep that in mind. As a result, you need to have some notion of how to measure the impact. Is it a big impact? Is it a small impact? Is there some way I can move from a big to a small through some change in order of events, or change to my approach, or I don't know, change to timing, or linking it to some other activity? Sylvia mentioned earlier, Windows 7, Windows XP support is really this time going to stop. Are you going to continue to run an unsupported operating system, or are you going to migrate? And migrating to Windows 7 will give you an opportunity to also do some V6 stuff if you want to kind of link the two together, so you're only hitting your customer base once, your user community once. There's also the people who actually operate the network. What's the impact going to be on them? A lot of that's going to be changes in processes and procedures. A lot of it's going to be training, but you need to keep all of that in account and be able to enumerate it in your plan. And then there's the cost of all of this. When Sylvia was up here and saying you're talking to your boss, and one of the motivations is to tell him how much money it's going to save him and how much of a better life he's going to have as a result of it. Well, that'll probably be true at some point after you're done, but getting there is going to cost money and it's going to take time. So just be sure that you've been able to assess that in a rational fashion. No boss that I know of, and I've been one, wants to be presented with a bill that's double the budget that the guy came and talked to you about, 3 months ago or 6 months ago when they asked for this. So you need to be sure that you're costing things realistically and you're talking about realistic amounts of time. Of course, you could always use the Scotty model, which is to take everything and multiply it by 6. Then you'll always be under budget and you'll always have enough time to get things done. But not all of us have the advantages of being the best engineer in Starfleet. Now you need to get to the designing phase. You've gathered all this information, you have a tremendous amount of data, and it's time to actually put the plan together. I talked about ITIL at the beginning of this talk. It is important that if you have an existing change management framework, you use it. There's no reason to invent a new wheel here. This is a big change management activity. That's what it is. So use your framework to make that make it easier for everybody to understand. Don't make it some completely different weirdo thing, because then they'll have to figure that out, and that just takes more time. So use your existing framework. If you don't have a framework, this might be a great pilot project to create one in. If you're an organization of any size, having a change management architecture is a boon to you long term. It helps mitigate costs, reduce risks, and it also helps keep everybody happier. Now, no one is happy with change. It seems to be a human condition that even though our life is constant change, we don't like it. But it's a fact of life, so being able to put some sort of change management framework in place is a good thing. Then you want to look at sequence of events and try and figure out something that will minimize the negative impact, maximize the positive impact, and be sure that everybody is communicated with all of the possible impacts in an appropriate fashion. So that should be part of your plan. Communication, communication, and more communication. I said earlier the perfect plan would be the one where you do it and no one notices. That is the perfect plan, but they should know that you were doing it. Okay? And then you need to have a set of fallback criteria. What happens when something unexpected happens? What do we do? Where do we go back to? Do we go back? All of those questions should be pre-answered. There should be no guesswork about what happens when something you don't expect happens. You should have a predefined strategy for handling those exceptional circumstances. Again, most change management policies, frameworks have those kinds of mechanisms built into them, so you'd be building it if you were using a framework. But if you don't have one, be sure you build it into at least this plan. Now, I wanted to talk a lot about training, because in all of the experience I've had with IPv6, the thing that is most overlooked in every transition that I've ever seen has been training. You know you've got the right operating systems running on the right boxes. You know that the infrastructure that you have in place will pass those bits. You've got a great renumbering plan. Although Sylvia's right, you sometimes have to think differently because it's IPv6 and you've got 128 bits instead of 32, and there's some considerations with how humans process that large a number that need to go into how you think about your numbering scheme. But that numbering scheme should be part of your training. Okay, it's important for everybody to feel comfortable with what's about to happen. And training is one way that you get that done. Gap analysis is necessary. The people you have, they've got certain skills, but there may be certain skills they don't have that you need to help them learn. There may be outside resources that you may need to bring in on a temporary basis to fill those gaps. Or you may need those temporary resources just to get you from point A to point B, and then you can let those resources go. But whatever the case is, you need to have a training plan that integrates tightly with your transition planning so that everybody is brought along for the ride and it's not just you and the guys who are actually moving the wires and programming the routers. Because ultimately, your operations staff is going to be tagged with having to run this thing once you've done it. And you don't want them coming in and go, what? What's this? Because you know who they're going to call, right? You. In the middle of the night, when you just had a big party and you can't actually put 3 words together. So, the other thing that you need to think about is your help desk. The frontline people that get the calls from the people going, I don't know where the on button is for my computer. Now, that shouldn't be an IPv6 problem, but you probably do have a help desk that does answer those kinds of questions. Having them have a familiarity and comfort with IPv6 and know the scenarios that they're likely to be asked about should be part of your training plan as well as your transition strategy. They need to come along for the ride as well as your operations staff. Finally, do you need to train your users? It's a good question. I usually list these as the order that I would prefer to train everybody. Systems operations and help desk are 2 groups that are not usually involved with the transition, but will get to have to operate the network afterwards. You're probably going to have to spend most of your training dollars on them. Your network operations and engineering people are probably going to be involved with the transition, so they're going to get a lot of training on the job, doing the actual work, working through all the processes. They may need some additional supplemental training, but they're probably going to get a lot of experience just doing the work of making it go. Applications development. Earlier, someone said, why aren't the game developers rolling out IPv6? Well, one of the answers might be that they don't know how to write IPv6 code. If you've got an internal applications development organization and you have any network-based applications of any type, they need to be brought along for the ride. Now, do they need the training before the transition, after the transition, or during the transition? That's a really good question. Part of it depends on your organization. But they do need to be trained if they're going to have to do anything that will involve writing a piece of code that will need to be IPv6 capable or dual stack capable if you're just adding v6 to your network. Now, what about users? Hard to say. Some users might need some training, some won't. A lot of it will depend on the application framework that you provide them to get their work every day. But if all they're doing is cranking up Windows 7 and running Office 2010, chances are probably not, because those applications already do it and they already do it just fine. But if they're having to look at anything that relates to internet numbers or DNS, yeah, they probably need some kind of training, because those are some of the things that are going to be impacted by adding IPv6 to your network. Your average sales guy probably doesn't do that unless we get that version of PowerPoint that Sylvia was talking about. Your average office worker who's filing papers or filling out tax forms or doing that sort of thing, probably not. So again, you know your environment better than I do. I can't give you a pat answer, but you do need to evaluate it. Finally, you get to implementation. No plan is written in concrete. if you're not prepared to adapt the plan as you move through a transition, you need to go back and think about being flexible. Organizations very rarely stand still waiting for you to deploy IPv6. They're going to be moving on with other agendas and other things. So you need to be sure that your plan has capability of being adapted to the current situation that you're doing the work in. It's the only way to ensure that you have the maximum level of success. Otherwise, they're going to say, why are you doing that? We quit doing things that way 2 months ago. Oh, gosh. You look really good in those circumstances, right? There's a lot of ways to approach this, and that's why I didn't lay out every single detail, but I did give some guidelines here on my slides. I don't know. Yeah, it's pretty readable, and you'll have a copy of them later. But essentially, the way that I look at doing a V6 transition is I start at the bottom of the stack and I move up the 7-layer stack. Everybody should be familiar with that. So you're looking at hardware, things at the very bottom first. You're moving up the stack to look at addressing and routing and all that. You're looking at software, looking at presentation to the users, et cetera. So again, may not work in your environment, but it's a place to start. Then I talked about communication. When you actually get into doing the plan, more communication is better than less. You probably don't want to get to the point that you're being perceived as Chicken Little. The IPv6 is falling, you don't want that. But you do want to be sure that you do communicate more than you think you should, because usually that's about the right level, frankly, is a little more than you think you should. And try to make it fun. Humans love to celebrate. Humans love to have a good time. Make the V6 transition a fun thing. Oh, look what cool stuff you can do today. The first guy who can find this secret little IPv6 Easter egg gets a wiener, hot dog, whatever. Make it fun. And whenever your team does a good job, celebrate it. Have a little beach party or whatever it is tradition for your organization. But celebrate this change, because they're going to have to live with the results a long time. You want to encourage them to do a good job, and one way to encourage them is to reward them a little bit. Ultimately, it has to become part of the status quo for the environment, because you're adding a new capability, you're integrating it. If you've done the integration well, it just becomes part of the daily routine. So that should be the end goal of any transition, is to be sure that in the final analysis, after it's all done, everybody's been trained, everybody understands what goes on, it's just part of what you do. Okay? It becomes the status quo. Oh, and one more thing, stealing from Steve Jobs. Evaluate. Look at what you did. Figure out what you did well. Remember that. Do it again the next time. What you did poorly, figure out why it didn't work. Don't make the same mistake twice. This is an IT project. There are things about it that can transition to other things that you do. So do an evaluation. Don't just do it and walk away, because it will help you be a better organization going forward, and it will help the next project, whatever it might be. Hopefully not IPv16 or whatever, but whatever, it'll help the next time you have to do something. If you want to know more, there are lots of websites that are available. Someone up here said earlier, I think it was Bruce, that this is a lot of information. It's not necessarily something that will provide you with a lot of teaching and learnings. But if you read this stuff and then you start to try the things that you learn about, you will learn. So take advantage of the resources that are on the internet today. Come to things like this. Talk to people. Use gogoNET social network if that's what you need to do. But don't be bashful. Ask questions. Try and learn stuff, because it makes it a whole lot easier if you learn it now before you actually do it, rather than being in the middle of an implementation and you run into a brick wall because you didn't expect that. Okay? Thanks for your time. If you'd like to learn more about me, you can go to these two websites. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you.